Hello friends! So today we're going to be talking about membrane, such as the resting membrane potential, as well as action potentials. And this is just going to be a review of your lectures that you've been going throughout the fall semester. So as we discussed in previous lectures, the action potential is basically just going to be the way that the neuron and the nervous system as a whole is going to send signals. So when we look at what an action potential actually is, it's a temporary reversal of the resting membrane potential on a localized or small area on the neuron's axon hillock. So when we look at the resting membrane potential here, we've drawn a fictionalized, simplified portion of the axon. So with this, what we're going to see is if we're going to pretend like this is the inside of the axon and this is the surrounding region of the membrane. And this is going to be the most basic version of the resting membrane potential. So in the basic membrane potential, the membrane potential is going to be typically staying at negative 70 millivolts. And this is going to be pretty typical for neurons across the nervous system. It's just going to mean that there is a net negative charge within the axon, within the actual cell, beneath kind of the membranes. And that's going to create a net positive charge on the surface of the membrane outside. So an important thing to note when considering this is that this is not in reference to any negative ions, otherwise known as anions. This is just relating to the cation concentration, so the positive ions. So this isn't to say that the inside has more negative ions and the outside only has positive ions. It's just there are fewer positive ions in here than there are out here. And that's why you kind of have that difference across the membrane. So, it's just a localized portion. So the ICF is just negative with respect to the outside of the cell, which is going to be net positive. However, when we instigate an action potential, as we discussed in the axon hillock, what's going to happen is just a reversal of what's going on here. So when we consider the action potential, this is what it's going to look like. So same basic portions, the ICF being here and the ECF being here, but now we have a difference in signs. So the inside now has more cations than the outside does. And so this is going to have a net positive charge that is ultimately going to end at around 30 millivolts. And this is what is known as the action potential. So let's talk a little bit more about this resting membrane potential, otherwise known as RMP, which, as we discussed just a second ago, is typically going to be at negative 70 millivolts. So, the components that make up the resting membrane potential, the things that kind of make it stay at negative 70 millivolts, are really important to know. The first of all being the Na plus and K plus ATP ACE pump. So this is directly contributing 20% of the resting membrane potential. This is essentially going to pump 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions pumped in. This is very important. It uses ATP to do this, so it's active transport. And it's just very important that it keeps a flow going of these ions. Next, you're going to look more at the uniports, and this is going to be known as selective membrane permeability exchange. And this is just basically that the resting membrane potential is more permeable to sodium than it is to potassium ions. So it's going to let sodium come in and potassium go out. And this is going to contribute to 80% of the resting membrane potential. If we want to say it in even simpler terms, this active transport is going to make up 20% of the resting membrane potential, whereas this passive transport, because they're just basically flowing through, this simple diffusion otherwise is going to be made up of 80% resting membrane potential. However, this is ultimately and indirectly driven by the sodium-potassium ATPase pump anyway. So really this pump is much more important than we can even give it credit for. So when we talk further about this ATPase pump, we're going to be looking at active transport, right? It's right in the name. ATPase meaning the ATP, it's using ATP, and ACE always denotes enzyme. So it's using enzymatic activity with ATP. ATP, of course, being the primary energy source for biological processes. So this is essentially going to create 3 gradients. There's going to be a sodium gradient concentration, which is higher in the ECF, but it's also going to pump into the ECF, which is why we need to use active transport. Then we're going to have potassium, or K plus gradient concentration, which is higher within the ICF, and it's, again, being pumped directly into the ICF, which is, again, why you need to use active transport in order to do so, because it's going directly against its gradient. And it's not going to want to pump in the thing that it already has a higher concentration of in here, but it's going to do it anyway with the use of ATP. And then finally, the last gradient is going to be a charge gradient. so that's going to be what you see over here, which is when it's more positive in the ECF than it is in the ICF. This is just a simple gradient. So this gradient, especially this charge gradient, is going to be made from the 3 to 2 ion exchange, where there's more going out here than there is coming in. So the ECF ends up being more positive because we're adding more of these positive ions to the outside, to the ECF, which is going to create the positive gradient. So you can almost say, kind of like what you have up here, but instead of Na+, you could even exchange that for high cation concentration. That's just pretty important. So again, looking at the selective membrane permeability, the resting membrane is 75 times more permeable to potassium than it is to sodium. So the potassium is going to leave the cell, or efflux, more than sodium is going to be entering, influx, which is what you can see with these uniports, right? So you can see that sodium is coming in little line, as opposed to potassium, which is going out massively. And that's just due to the selective membrane permeability. So this is, of course, through passive transport, so it's just going with its gradient instead of against it. We're not going to be having to use ATP for this process. It's just basically going to flow in. And this uniport, which is going to be basically these breaks in the membranes that are going to allow the ions to get through, are going to be needed because the ions are polar and charged, which, as we know, it just can't simply flow through the membrane without the help of something. And the help is going to form in the use of these uniports. So this resting membrane potential is going to stop ultimately at -70 millivolts due to a haltage of further cation efflux. So basically the exchange is just going to slow, and it's not going to happen on such a large account just because it would continue getting more and more negative, which is something that we just can't have, because it wants to reach equilibrium at -70 millivolts. And ultimately the potassium efflux, so this passive transport massively of potassium going out, is going to be prevented by electrostatic repulsion. So that's just a little bit of a background as to why it's -70 millivolts, which is going to be pretty important when we're considering how action potentials run. So, in response to that, let's tackle a little bit more of what an action potential means and what it encompasses. So an action potential is going to be when this -70 millivolt, which was from the RMP, is going to be transformed into -50 millivolts at the axon hillock, which is then going to cause a fuller depolarization to 30 millivolts. And we'll discuss that in more detail as we go on through here. Let's first consider the mechanism of action potentials. So what's basically going to happen is when you're thinking of the cell as a whole, right, you have the dendrites and the soma integrating these graded potentials, right? And once they reach the axon hillock, if this is interpreted as a positive 20 millivolt signal, it's going to begin an action potential at the axon hillock. So in other words, the mechanism of these action potentials is going to be when positive feedback opening of voltage-gated sodium channels on a localized patch of membrane starts at the axon hillock. So basically what I said before, but just that this is going to be positive feedback, which is very important to note. It's going to be one of the only cases that we talk about in this class with positive feedback. That's going to open voltage-gated sodium channels, which we're going to talk about a little bit further. If it's voltage-gated, when we say this word, what we basically mean is that it's going to open when a certain voltage is reached. So when this occurs, when these sodium channels are going to open, there's going to be a resultant sodium influx via simple diffusion, which is going to represent the local current flow, or LCF, which is going to temporarily reverse the membrane potential. What this basically means is that there's just going to be sodium coming in to the cell because these channels have opened. As you can see, when you contrast this picture to the resting membrane picture, you can see that the major change has been the voltage-gated channels opening. So this is just going to occur when the voltage across the membrane is going to reach the action potential level. So this sodium that's coming in is going to cause local current flow. This is going to help reverse the membrane potential, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier. So when we say reverse the membrane potential, what we're going to do here is it's going to be reversed, right? So we have the negatives out here, and these are going to be positives because it's completely reversed from the membrane potential. So the other word for all of this happening is going to be depolarization. So there is a specific mechanism as well for depolarization that we can break down into more parts. So in response to a stimulus, aka the voltage that's being brought in, the graded potentials by the dendrites that are going to be integrated at the soma, a few voltage-gated sodium channels are going to open on a localized patch of membrane at the axon hillock. This is going to cause the sodium to rush in via simple diffusion, which is going to increase the membrane potential from negative 70 millivolts to negative 50 millivolts. This 20-degree millivolt change is going to be known as the threshold potential. So from negative 70 to negative 50. Once it reaches negative 50, this is going to cause an action potential no matter what. However, if the threshold is not reached, then nothing is sensed due to the stopping of the action potential. If it doesn't reach negative 50, then the action potential is not going to occur at all. It's not that it's going to be smaller or take longer or whatnot. It's just not going to happen. So at this threshold, if it's reached, if we get to negative 50, more sodium channels are going to open, the voltage-gated ones, which is going to allow for even more sodium to come in via simple diffusion. This is going to further increase the membrane potential. It's going to jump all the way to 30 millivolts, which is known as the action potential. At 30 millivolts, you're going to reach the sodium equilibrium potential. So the concentration gradient is equal in magnitude, but in opposite direction than the cation gradient, which is basically going to mean that it's going to stop getting more positive. It's just going to stop at 30 millivolts. This is going to be what's known as your action potential. You're going to have a reversal of the electrical gradient, as well as a change in the way that the concentration gradients are going. And as the sodium rushes into the membrane, it's going to go along the axon. It's going to travel via local current flow and help propagate the signal as it flows down. I would like to clarify that also during that time, these voltage-gated potassium channels would actually be closed. We just had them open for the picture's sake. But as we move into the next section, which is called repolarization, these voltage-gated potassium channels are going to open, whereas the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close. So there's no longer going to be an inflow of this through these specific channels. So once we reach 30 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close, as we see here. And the voltage-gated potassium channels, as we see here, are going to open. Again, these don't open until repolarization. This is going to allow for a potassium efflux, or outgoing, via simple diffusion that decreases the membrane potential from the 30 millivolts, very high, very positive, to negative 90 millivolts, which is causing a hyperpolarization. So once again, we are going to change this signal around. It's going to massively, massively, massively reverse the membrane potential once more. So now we're not even going back to resting membrane potential yet. We're going all the way from 30 millivolts to negative 90 millivolts. That's going to be a 120 millivolt difference. It's a very, very big change. So again, this is going to be called hyperpolarization. So during this time of hyperpolarization, the cell cannot be re-stimulated. You're not going to get another action potential coming through. And the cell cannot get more negative because we've reached now the potassium equilibrium potential. So these further cation movements are prevented via electrostatic repulsion, as we mentioned earlier. So at negative 90 millivolts, these voltage-gated potassium channels are going to close. They are not open. We don't want them to be open. Business is shut down for right now. So now the membrane potential is going to go back to negative 70 millivolts because of all these things that are going on that we talked about with the resting membrane potential. Because these voltage-gated channels are now closed. Both of them are closed. Now, because we're at negative 90, that's not at the equilibrium we want overall. We want the resting membrane potential back, which is negative 70, and we're at negative 90 right now. So these things are going to close. And then So an important thing to note is that the pump, the ATPase pump, is not going to make the ICF more positive, and it doesn't help return the cell to negative 70 millivolts. It's mostly just going to be kind of these uniport passive potential, or passive transport action. So the uniports are majorly what's going to repolarize the cell. And this repolarization is negative feedback because the cell is returning to set point. So that's basically the whole thing. So let's look at the process overall one last time before we put this point to rest for this video. It's going to come up a lot more, trust me. So basically, the major cycle is you start at resting membrane potential, you go to action potential, you go back to resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential is going to be negative 70 millivolts. Then through depolarization and summation at the axon hillock, you're going to reach negative 50 millivolts, which is going to start the action potential, which goes to 30 millivolts. Once it reaches 30 millivolts, we're going to go through hyperpolarization and repolarization to negative 90. And the repolarization is going to finish the job by returning the membrane potential to its resting membrane potential at negative 70. So -70, -50, 30, -90, -70. Another important thing to sum up this concept are the characteristics of action potentials. So, as we mentioned toward the beginning of the video, it has an all or nothing principle. The action potential is either going to happen or it's not. It either reaches 30 millivolts or it doesn't. It doesn't go to 17 sometimes or -11. It always goes from -50 to 30. When you're looking at an action potential on a graph, when it's kind of showing you how the membrane potential is changing, the action potential is going to have a spike phase. And so this depolarization to 30 millivolts is just going to be really, really short. It lasts about 0.5 milliseconds. And basically, if you can follow my pencil, this is going to be the resting membrane. And then the action potential just basically goes whoop, and then down, and then returns back. And that's going to be pretty characteristic of the graphing of the millivolts that you're going to see pretty commonly. The third component is that it's going to be a local event. It's going to start at the hillock. It's not going to start anywhere else. It's going to start at the hillock. Fourth component is that action potentials are propagated, which means it's basically sent along the axon non-decrementally. So it's not going to lose energy. And that's pretty important to note as well, how the action potential is not going to begin and then not reach the end, because it's not going to lose any energy. So it's always going to go all the way down. And then finally, the last component of an action potential is that there's going to be a refractory period. So we mentioned this very briefly when talking about repolarization, but basically there's a rest period between action potentials. So once a patch of membrane, if we say all my fingers are patches of membranes, then once they are affected, they go down, and it's not until a little bit later that they're all going to pop back up. And this is just so that the action potential only travels in one direction. So if my fingers over here are knocked down and it has to go forward, it's not going to go backwards because these fingers are still down. And these parts of the membrane are still kind of repolarizing back to the norm. And they have to repolarize until we're able to send another action potential. So those are the main components of action potentials or resting membrane potentials, and just membrane potentials as a whole. This is going to be really important when we're considering how reflexes are done, how actions are done, how literally any component of your nervous system energy signal propagation is going to be completed. It's going to use these action potentials all the time. Even you comprehending this lecture right now, listening to my voice, it's causing action potentials in your brain. The reason why you're able to understand what I'm saying, the reason why you're able to hear what I'm saying, is because of action potentials that are firing within your nervous system. So it's just a pretty important concept. It's one that'll honestly probably come up in a lot of your other classes. So just take note of that. If it helps, go back over the recordings of the lectures that you might have, go back over this video, revisit the topics that you need, because it is pretty important to know, and it can be confusing to understand to begin with, but it'll be less so the more that you try and integrate this information into the way that you think about action potentials as a whole. So thank you. Have a good day.